13. Enemies. No dreams clouded Ichtak's unconscious hours, nor did visions and voices jolt him into wakefulness. His memory was of lying in the shade of the tanks beneath the thudding thunder of machine guns, mumbling to his Ektal charges before waking groggy and battered in a Kushkotlan hospital bed, entirely aware of the fiery waves rushing over him every time he made to shift his upper body. His head swam, his shoulders felt bruised beyond measure, and his neck cried out each time he craned his eye around to drink in his surroundings. The silent ward all around him was not empty, hosting many Sholoshaitians injured in the breaking of the siege. Seeing the sigils of Kushkotlan's royal crest on the walls, he assumed the battle had been won, but he didn't have to wonder long. A voice reached his ears as a familiar figure rounded the edge of the curtained division obscuring the beds to either side. "You're hard to keep down," Tishak said, his friend fast pulling the small stool beside the bed up to take a seat. "Need something to drink?" The lean warrior offered up a stone mug of steaming cocoa, its scent taunting Ichtak's nose, making him realize how hungry he was. His mind was carried back to Tepeklan by the treat for which the city was famed, and for a moment he was put at ease. He accepted, struggling into a sitting position on the bed before struggling just as hard not to burn himself, nursing the offered drink. "How's the push going?" "It's won, or close to it," Tishak told him. "Tanks and armored cars are helping to run the Ida north of the border, and mountaineer units are being reordered to shore up the passes until the defenses can be repaired." Ichtak nodded, once again scanning the windowless hall before asking, "How long have I been out?" "Since this morning," Tishak said. "It's just past sundown now." Ichtak nodded, clutching the cup and wrenching shut his eye. Even the low light of the ward made his skull ache. "And Ruhualpa?" Tishak lowered his head. Ichtak needed no explanation to know what that meant. He had been expecting the news, the belief that the High Marshal was gone gnawing at the roots of his mind, the worry haunting him both before and after his long, concussive sleep. That did nothing to soften the blow. The prince nodded, more to shake himself from the stupor the words had put him in, than to signal his understanding. "How did it happen?" "During the final push up the northern ridges, our men were being harassed with stones and Jezzail fire from above," Tishak told him. "Word is High Marshal Ruhualpa came forward to lead the rest of the charge up into the pass himself when the advance faltered. He made the top, but didn't survive his wounds." "Did he pass here?" "On the battlefield," Tishak answered, a bittersweet grin on his face. "Good," Ichtak breathed, taking some small comfort in that. "That's good. He'd have had it no other way." "Gone the way of warriors before he grew old and feeble," Tishak agreed. "Any Sholoshaitian would envy that, but Sholoshaiti is poorer without him." "The most Sholoshaitian Kandari on the face of the globe," said Ichtak. He turned the beginnings of a ruptured intake of sobbing air into a chuckle. It was well masked. If Tishak had noticed, he didn't acknowledge it. "Shoshot too," Tishak said. "I knew Pochtli must be gone, but I had thought Shoshot might make it. He was always tough as steel." "Good deaths for all of them, then." They fell silent a moment, Ichtak letting his mind rearrange the world around him without some of its most vital players. No night's drunken distraction in the capital would ever feel right again without Shoshot's almost profound cursing, nor would the sight of lone Pokoat void of his twin across the table sit right as the night wore on. Worst of all, he would have to slog through the realizations and reverberations of that cold new world without his truest and oldest counsel, snickering hyena-like before imparting the wisdom of a soldier's life well lived. Beneath all that, cold as the world might seem, the old, white-hot serpent of rage stirred within him. His head throbbed, as much with thoughts of vengeance against amorphous and nameless foes as with the concussive aftermath of the day's combat. Exhaling, he stifled the feelings as he had stifled the tears, turning his attention fully to Tishak again. "Are you unhurt?" "Pretty much," Tishak laughed, slippery as ever. "Just some bruises to show for the trouble. Pacoat has a broken arm, but he's still up and about, ill-tempered as ever, though the feeling's well-deserved now, I suppose." "Harakwe knows we all have reasons to be ill-tempered," said Ichtak. "Have the Ektal been buzzing about investigations? Her Highness must be turning over every stone in the Empire for information." "There were Ektal reports sent up the chain through the telegraph offices this afternoon," said Tishak. "That's the rumor mill's fodder, anyway. Which reminds me." Tishak went into the pockets of his trousers, fishing around for a moment before bringing out a crumpled note and offering it up to Ichtak. "An Ektal courier brought it for you just as we were carrying you off the field," explained Tishak. "Your eyes only, as ever. Well, your eye." Tishak grinned wide, and Ichtak put on the mimed grimace of an old friend. He went to reading, once more warmed by the familiar coded handwriting. As he dug further into the text, the warmth fast fled, replaced by a nervous chill. "There were detonations at the border," Tishak went on, dragging Ichtak's eye away from the note. "Some kind of bombings before the invasion. There's whispers it was sabotage to soften up the passes for the Ida. The priesthood has had inquisitors snooping around the barracks and hospitals, which hasn't helped the rumor mill calm down much. The as-yet baseless assumption is that some steel or weapon manufacturers in the capital are to blame, maybe looking to drive up contracts with the state should a long war kick off." Ichtak's heart skipped a beat at the word inquisitor. Ichtak tapped the note absently. "Are the court physicians from Tepeklan here?" "Of course," said Tishak. "I doubt they'd trust you with Kushkotlans, even if they are first class." Ichtak slid from the bed, bruised head and neck wobbling, his balance taking a moment to right itself as the room spun around him. Tishak rose to move him back towards the cot, but the prince shoved him off. "I'll need to see him." Tishak snorted, following after the prince as he made his tentative way in nothing but a loose red gown into the corridor between the beds, asking, "Who?" "An orderly, apprentice to my court physician," Ichtak explained. "Setiawan, young Lautani man, the only orderly with fur in the ward." "We'll wake Tepecoat, then, if it's that important," Tishak said. Tishak led the way to a small hall of modest private rooms. The Ektal attendant at the entrance bowed slightly and let the wavering prince pass before pointing them to one of the doors. A knock brought an almost immediate answer, a stern, elderly Sholoshaishan with gray skin so pale it almost seemed alabaster coming into view. "Your Majesty," Tepecoat exclaimed, the tired wear of the day dismissed. "I'm glad to see you awake, but you should really be in bed. You've done enough to earn the rest." "Where is Setiawan?" Tepecoat paused, eyes narrowing, saying, "The Inquisition came by early in the afternoon asking questions. I believe they have him now. I supposed it was something to do with all the odd happenings at the border." Ichtak's heart thrummed, exacerbating for a moment the spinning tension in his skull. He swayed slightly, but righted himself, unwilling to budge. "His quarters?" "Downstairs with the others, and totally looted," Tepecoat reported. "I've been with most of the men in assuming the Duumvirate might be behind it. Do you suppose he was a Lautani informant of some kind?" Ichtak turned with a wave of dismissal to the old doctor, saying nothing. trotting from the ward and into the Kushkotlan Palace complex beyond without word to anyone. Tishak followed after, keeping within arm's reach of the prince lest he spill over onto the old stone of the palace. Tishak sighed as they pushed across a moonlit courtyard and towards the makeshift officers' barracks, which had been set up in the storage cellars beneath the packed guard quarters, asking, "Who are we after?" "Someone in the Ektal I can trust." "Thanks for the confidence." "You know what I mean." His tone kept Tishak quiet throughout the rest of their walk. "I expected you'd come knocking eventually, Your Highness," Ektal Legate Tlaloc told him. "I just didn't expect it so soon." Tlaloc shut the door to his small chamber, a rough-hewn stone space which was likely little more than a cupboard before the Ida incursion had brought the armies of the wider empire north to aid Kushkotlan. Tishak had been left to sit outside, a move which Ichtak knew must grate upon him, but he needed the legate to feel at ease, alone with a member of Tepeklan's royal house, who doubled as an old companion. "It eats at me what happened to Ruhualpa," Tlaloc told him, taking a seat at the foot of his simple bed and offering Ichtak the lone chair. "I always figured it would be the big war that took him one day." Tlaloc did not need to explain what he meant by big war. The phrase had become so common among the Shaloshaitan officer corps that it had trickled down into the common parlance of the martial nation. "Ida are Harakwe's oldest foes," said Ichtak. "I'm sure Ruhualpa is proud enough to have fallen fighting them." "I know, and I mean my old friend no disrespect," Tlaloc explained. "We just both made our bones in the last loud Shaloshaitan war. I always assumed we'd break them the same way." Tlaloc fell silent, looking down at the floor for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. Ichtak took the opportunity to speak. "I've come here with questions," said Ichtak. "I was hoping you, having been close with Ruhualpa, would answer them truthfully. Moreover, I was hoping you might answer them confidentially." Tlaloc's eyes rose to meet him. "What kind of questions?" "Did Ruhualpa share his doubts with you, about his suspicions regarding the border being so easily breached by the Ida?" Tlaloc considered the words, nodding slightly. "He has often mentioned his feelings on the Tlatoani's tolerance of wealthy civilian advisors, but this seemed different. Ruhualpa asked me during the ride north to keep his position clear with the Tlatoani if he could not, as if he knew he wouldn't be there to make the case himself. He knew the battle meant danger, and his dreams reinforced that," said Ichtak. "Whatever the case is, he told me much the same. Ruhualpa asked me to keep alive his opposition to peace, to represent his camp in the event of his passing. To do that, I'll need some help." Ichtak produced the paper he'd been handed in the ward. He shifted over to show Tlaloc, translating the simple yet obscure coding of the message, ensuring the gravity of the words were not lost on the seasoned commander. "I have great trust in this source," said Ichtak. "He happens, however, to be Lautani, a man of the southern peninsula. He thought the Inquisition were to blame for the breach. He elaborates on their movements before the Ida incursion here. Now, Inquisitors have whisked him away, ostensibly on the orders of my mother, and he's beyond my reach." Ichtak handed the note over and returned to his seat, his fists clenched tight. "If someone is really providing for and provoking assaults on the homeland by sea, whether it be the industrialists or the priesthood, we have to know," Ichtak told him. "I don't know whether I can trust my mother and her eyes in the capital's clergy to be forthright with the findings, for obvious reasons. I need Ektal men on the job, and I need them soon." Tlaloc looked the paper over, sighing. He nodded his agreement, still stewing over the new information. "Do you have contacts in the Navy that might verify the reports?" I do, Tlaloc answered. I'll write through Ektal channels and ensure the Admiralty is on the lookout for information. If there are strange ships, Lautani or otherwise, heading north for the Idalands, they'll know. Ensure the channels are closed to any exchanges of hands that bring them near priests, Ichtak warned him. Given the abduction of my own contact, I have reason to believe my Ektal-held messages might have been compromised. While it's inevitable they will find out what's happening eventually, do your best to delay it. Tlaloc shook his head, his expression conflicted, as if he were debating internally whether to continue with what he had to say. You're certain you want to walk this road? I've never been more certain, said Ichtak. There are few things more important to me than the honor of Sholosh'aidi. If honor is to be forsaken in the name of profit or politics, I would know about it. Tlaloc smiled, the expression almost pained, saying, Ruhualpa really did rub off on you. I'll let the Admiralty know the orders are from the throne. I'll accept the ramifications if that comes back to bite me. Ichtak nodded, stricken silent for a long moment by the calm admission. I appreciate that. There are not many officers in the Empire who would risk the Tlatoani's wrath. My old friend is gone, said Tlaloc. Perhaps a bit of his foolishness has rubbed off on me as well. He would have done the same, and I won't leave you wanting. He smiled. Ichtak had not known the legate nearly as intimately as he had Ruhualpa, but it was given with the same kind of affection. When we were on the lines during the thickest fighting, Ruhualpa would always finish the day talking about how the soldiers and commanders of centuries to come would remember the fighting. He'd say, that was nothing like the siege of Tepeklan, or something just as grandiose, and tell us all how we should be jilted to have missed a real struggle. Ichtak smiled. Then we attacked Eztlan for the first time, Tlaloc said. If you think it was fierce when we rounded off the rebels, you should have seen it when the Lautani Navy ruled the harbor. I'm sure you've heard the stories. Ruhualpa would have told you. About conditions, about your father. The fighting lasted weeks, street to street, building to building. They would bring in men and we would bring in men. No amount of corpses would clog the grinder. I remember when the flag was raised on the bank near the commons, Ruhualpa was on top, ragged and wounded, Tlaloc recalled, his eyes far distant. All the fiercest had pushed through the building, room to room, clearing out the enemy. I was on the cobbles, head split open, looking up like a fool. Tlaloc nudged the old scar trailing lazily across his skull between his ears with his thumb, marring the place where his silvered tuft of hair would be if he were not on the warpath. It was worn with all the pride due such a mark by Sholosh'aidi's traditions. The old officer smiled. That night when he was limping into the hospital tent to see us, all the medical staff yelling he should be on the cots, he'd say, that was something worth writing songs about, like he'd just had the time of his life. Tlaloc sighed again, scratching his chin absently, his eyes still far from the room on the distant streets of Eztlan. I was never that kind of soldier, Tlaloc mused. I was too focused on the men who'd died, the blood and the agony along the way, to think about how important what we were doing had been. There was something about Ruhualpa, though, something almost superhuman. He could parse out the most golden moments in a struggle. He never lost sight of what the lives had been laid down for. It was like he saw it all from the next century, from a mile high, with all the context and meaning laid bare for him. Tlaloc looked to Ichtak then. His eyes were warm, but stern. The weight of a lifetime's witnessed death was behind them, and the prince took each syllable spoken beneath that gaze to heart. Soldiers like Ruhualpa built this empire, Tlaloc said. They gave blood for it every step of the way, never asking whether the gains were worth the price. He would have said that was because of the tradition, the love of your home, the honor of your faith. I would contend the price is worthy precisely because of men like that. Tlaloc's eyes were distant, but he did not allow emotion to take hold of him. You have a duty to him and everyone like him, Tlaloc said. If we find that some domestic body is responsible for this, and Her Highness either issued the order or stood by after its unveiling, then what honor can we say we did their memories? What honor does that leave the thousands dead outside these walls? Ichtak sat in silence, absorbing what had been said, almost hesitant to follow in the footsteps of such heavy words. Harakwe take me if I don't live up to them, then, said Ichtak. Tlaloc nodded, a faint grin on his face. Ruhualpa trusted you, Tlaloc said. Loved you, even. Proud in the way a father would be to see you in the destroyer plate yesterday. Ichtak was stricken hard by that, harder than he had anticipated. It was all he could do to remain stone-faced before the old officer, returning his smile. You had his trust, so you have my trust. I'll remember it, said Ichtak, clasping his offered hand.